The highway stretched before them, an endless ribbon of asphalt that disappeared into the night, swallowed whole by the horizon. The wind outside howled like a hungry beast, rattling the windows of the car as the dark woods loomed on either side. Inside, the hum of the engine was the only sound, a monotonous drone that mirrored the growing tension in the silence between them. "Maybe we should turn back," Jenna whispered, her voice barely louder than the wind. Greg kept his eyes on the road, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. "No, we're too far now. We need to keep going." There was something wrong with this road. It was more than the cracked pavement and faded lines. There was something deeply unsettling about the way the trees seemed to close in, like the forest itself was alive, watching them, waiting. But the worst part wasn't the road or the woods. It was the fact that no matter how long they drove, the scenery never seemed to change. Jenna glanced at the clock on the dashboard. 11:47 p.m. It had been that time for the last 2 hours. "Greg," she said, her voice shaking now, "the clock's not moving." He didn't respond. His jaw was clenched tight, his eyes fixed ahead. He wasn't ignoring her. He was scared. Jenna could see it in the way his breathing quickened, in the way his shoulders tensed each time the road twisted sharply ahead. They were trapped, and he knew it. The first strange thing had happened just after they'd taken a wrong turn. They'd been driving home from a weekend camping trip with friends, eager to get back to civilization, when Greg had missed the exit. "I'll take the next one," he'd said. But the next exit never came. Jenna had tried to check the GPS, but it refused to load. No signal, no maps, no way out. Now, they were lost on a road that wasn't on any map, in a place that shouldn't exist. Suddenly, a figure darted across the road. "Greg!" Jenna screamed. Greg swerved sharply, the tires screeching as the car veered off the road and crashed into a ditch. The force of the impact threw them both forward, and for a moment, everything went black. When Jenna opened her eyes, her head was throbbing, and the taste of blood filled her mouth. The air was thick with dust, and the headlights cast long, eerie shadows over the road. She looked over at Greg, who was still gripping the wheel, his chest heaving as he struggled to catch his breath. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I think so," Greg replied, though his voice was hollow, distant. He was staring straight ahead, his face pale. Jenna followed his gaze. Standing in the middle of the road was the figure, a woman, dressed in torn, tattered clothing, her hair wild and matted. Her eyes were hollow, and her mouth hung open in a silent scream. And then she vanished. Greg cursed under his breath, fumbling with his seatbelt. "We have to get out of here." He opened the door and stumbled out, Jenna close behind. They stood in the cold night air, breathing hard, their eyes darting around the silent woods. The car was a wreck, the front bumper crushed, but it was still running. "Maybe we can drive it out of the ditch," Greg muttered, but his voice held no hope. Jenna wasn't listening. She was staring down the road, where the woman had stood. There was no trace of her, no footprints, no sound, just the endless, oppressive quiet of the woods. "This isn't real," Jenna whispered. "It can't be." Greg didn't answer. He was already back in the car, trying in vain to reverse out of the ditch. The tires spun uselessly in the mud, throwing up clods of dirt and leaves. "Help me push," Greg called, but Jenna couldn't move. Something was wrong. Something was terribly wrong. The air was too still, the silence too heavy, and the road seemed to pulse as if it were alive. And then she heard it, a low, guttural growl, coming from the trees. Jenna's blood ran cold. "Greg," she whispered, her voice barely audible. He didn't hear her. The growl grew louder, closer, and then, from the darkness of the woods, something emerged. It was a shadow, a hulking mass that moved on all fours, its eyes glowing red in the dim light of the headlights. It was unlike anything Jenna had ever seen, a creature made of darkness, its form shifting and writhing as it slunk toward them. Jenna stumbled backward, her heart pounding in her chest. "Greg!" she screamed. But it was too late. The creature lunged, and the last thing Jenna saw before the world went dark was its gaping maw, filled with rows of jagged teeth. Jenna awoke with a start, her body aching from the crash. Her vision was blurry, her head pounding. She was still in the car, the seatbelt tight around her chest, but something was wrong. The air was thick, suffocating, and the darkness outside the car felt wrong, as if it were alive. "Greg!" she called out, her voice hoarse. No answer. She turned to the driver's seat, but Greg wasn't there. The door was open, the engine still idling, but there was no sign of him. Panic surged through her veins as she unbuckled her seatbelt and scrambled out of the car. The night was unnaturally quiet, the only sound her own ragged breathing. "Greg!" she shouted, her voice echoing through the trees. Still nothing. Her eyes darted around, searching for any sign of movement, but the woods were still, the road empty. It was as if Greg had vanished into thin air. And then she saw it. In the distance, barely visible in the faint glow of the headlights, was a figure standing in the middle of the road. A woman, dressed in the same tattered clothes as before, her hair hanging in matted clumps around her face. "Who are you?" Jenna called out, her voice shaking. The woman didn't answer. She just stood there, staring, her eyes hollow and empty. Jenna's heart raced as she took a step forward, her legs trembling beneath her. She had to find Greg. She had to get out of this nightmare. But as she approached the woman, a sense of dread washed over her, freezing her in place. The woman's mouth twisted into a grin, her teeth yellow and sharp, and then, with a sickening crack, her body contorted, bending in ways no human body should bend. Her limbs stretched, her bones snapping as she dropped to all fours, her form shifting into something monstrous. Jenna screamed, stumbling backward as the creature, no longer human, lunged toward her. But before it could reach her, it stopped, its head jerking toward the woods as if it had heard something. Then, with a snarl, it vanished into the trees, leaving Jenna alone in the middle of the road, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't wait to see what would happen next. She turned and ran. The road stretched on endlessly, the woods on either side a dark, suffocating wall. Her legs burned, her lungs screamed for air, but she couldn't stop. Not now. Not when that thing was still out there. But no matter how far she ran, the road never seemed to end. It was as if she were trapped in some twisted loop, doomed to run forever. And then, up ahead, she saw it. A car. Greg's car. But how? How was it possible? Jenna slowed to a stop, her chest heaving as she stared at the wrecked car in front of her. It was the same car she had just escaped from, the same headlights casting long shadows across the road. She was back where she had started. "No," she whispered, shaking her head in disbelief. "This can't be happening." But it was. The road was a trap, and there was no way out. Jenna stood frozen, her mind reeling as she stared at the car. The cold realization that she had been running in a circle hit her like a punch to the gut. Her legs trembled beneath her, the air thick with the weight of the oppressive silence around her. Her thoughts raced in frantic circles. Greg was missing, the creature was out there, and the road wasn't just a road. It was something far worse. She took a step forward, then stopped. The car was still running. Its headlights illuminated the eerily familiar stretch of highway that seemed to twist and curve into oblivion. The woods surrounding her were dark and impenetrable, a living wall of black shadows. Her heart pounded in her chest. She couldn't go back to the car. That was where it had all started. But she couldn't stay in the open, either. She had no choice. Jenna's feet dragged as she made her way toward the vehicle. The door creaked when she opened it, and the eerie familiarity of the interior, the dashboard, the seats, felt wrong, like an echo of something that shouldn't be repeating itself. "Greg," she called again, knowing she wouldn't hear an answer. Yet, her voice was trembling, hoping for any response. Suddenly, the sound of crunching leaves echoed from the woods. Jenna's head snapped in that direction, her pulse quickening. The hair on the back of her neck stood on end. She slowly stepped backward, closer to the car. The growl from before returned, low and guttural, vibrating through the stillness. It wasn't far away. Jenna dove back into the car, slamming the door shut. The engine sputtered, and for a horrifying moment, she thought it would die. But then it roared to life. She threw it into gear, tires screeching as she jerked the wheel, trying to reverse out of the ditch. It worked. She sped down the road, her knuckles white against the steering wheel. But no matter how fast she drove, the feeling that something was chasing her wouldn't go away. "Please," she whispered to herself, tears stinging her eyes. "Please let this end." The trees whipped by, shadows looming over the road like twisted specters. Jenna glanced in the rearview mirror, but there was nothing. Only darkness. Only the void. She drove for what felt like hours. And then she saw it. The figure. The woman. Standing in the middle of the road again. "No," Jenna breathed. But there she was, her tattered dress billowing in the wind, her empty eyes watching Jenna approach. The headlights reflected off her pale face, her mouth hanging open in that same terrifying, silent scream. Jenna swerved to avoid her, but it was too late. There was a sickening thud, and the woman's body was flung to the side of the road. Jenna's heart seized in her chest as she skidded to a stop, the tires squealing in protest. The car shuddered to a halt. For a moment, everything was silent. Jenna's breath came in ragged gasps. She sat frozen in the driver's seat, her hands trembling, unable to comprehend what had just happened. "I hit her," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I hit her." She forced herself to look in the rearview mirror, but there was nothing there. Slowly, Jenna opened the door, her legs shaking as she stepped out into the cold night air. She approached the spot where the woman's body should have been lying, but there was no body, no blood, nothing, just the empty road stretching endlessly into the darkness. Jenna's heart raced, her mind spinning with confusion and fear. She turned back toward the car, but as she did, a voice, low and barely audible, whispered in her ear, "You can't leave." Jenna spun around, her eyes wide, searching the shadows. "Who's there?" she cried, her voice cracking. No one answered. She stumbled back toward the car, her heart pounding in her chest. She had to keep moving. She had to get out of here. But just as she reached for the door handle, something cold and wet touched her ankle. Jenna screamed, jumping back as she looked down. The asphalt beneath her feet was no longer solid. It was soft, black, and oozing like tar. It bubbled and churned, spreading outward in every direction. Her foot sank into it, the ground pulling her down like quicksand. She screamed, struggling to free herself, but the more she fought. Jenna thrashed wildly, her hands clawing at the car door, desperate to find solid ground. But the dark ooze that had replaced the asphalt was relentless. It coiled around her legs like a living thing, pulling her deeper into its suffocating grip. Her shoes were already swallowed, and her legs were sinking fast. "No!" she screamed, her voice cracking with terror. She clawed at the car, her fingers slipping on the smooth metal as the ooze pulled her down. Panic surged through her body. Every muscle in her legs burned as she fought against the sickening grip of the road. But it was no use. The harder she struggled, the faster she sank. Her knees disappeared into the sludge, then her waist. It was pulling her under, and soon she would be gone. A cold sweat broke out on her skin as she realized what was happening. This wasn't just a road, it was alive, and it wanted to devour her whole. As Jenna's breath came in shallow gasps, she felt a hand grab her arm. Strong, solid, and human. "Hold on," a voice commanded. Jenna looked up to see Greg, his face pale but determined, pulling her with all his strength. She couldn't believe it. He was here, alive. Relief washed over her, but only for a moment. With every ounce of strength left in her, she grabbed his arm, and together they fought against the pull of the road. Inch by inch, Greg hauled her out of the black tar-like substance. The ooze clung to her legs, resisting, but finally, she collapsed onto the ground, gasping for air. Greg pulled her further away from the bubbling road and into the cold, solid dirt near the edge of the forest. They lay there for a moment, panting, both of them covered in muck and shaking from the terror of what had just happened. "Greg," Jenna whispered, her voice barely audible. "How did you—" "No time to explain," Greg interrupted, his eyes wild. "We have to get out of here. Now." He pulled her to her feet, and they started running, away from the car, away from the road that had almost consumed her. The woods loomed ahead, but they had no other choice. They couldn't stay on the road any longer. Branches whipped at their faces as they plunged into the trees, their footsteps muffled by the thick layer of leaves and pine needles that covered the forest floor. The air was cold and damp, filled with the scent of decaying wood. The deeper they went, the darker it became, until it was impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. But even in the thick of the forest, the sound of the road, a distant, echoing rumble, followed them, growing louder and louder. "What is that?" Jenna panted, her heart racing as they pushed through the underbrush. Greg didn't answer, his face pale and set with determination. He just kept running, his grip tight on Jenna's hand as if afraid to let go. But soon, the sound was everywhere. The road was no longer behind them. It was beneath them, above them. It surrounded them, twisting and warping reality itself. Suddenly, Greg stumbled, falling to the ground with a cry of pain. Jenna skidded to a halt, turning back to him. "Greg!" she cried, dropping to her knees beside him. His face was twisted in agony, his leg bent at an unnatural angle. "I can't," he gasped. "I can't keep going." Jenna's heart pounded in her chest, a deep, primal fear surging through her. She glanced around, but the woods were a maze of shadows. They couldn't stay here. The road would find them. "I'll help you," she whispered, her voice shaking. "We can make it. We just have to keep moving." But before she could lift him, the ground beneath them rumbled. A low, deep sound, like the growl of a beast waking from its slumber, rose from the earth. Jenna froze, her blood running cold. The dirt began to shift beneath them, cracking open, and from the shadows of the trees, figures emerged. Not human, not animal, but something far worse. They moved with jerky, unnatural motions, their faces twisted in expressions of pain and anger. The woman from the road was among them, her hollow eyes fixed on Jenna, her mouth hanging open in that silent scream. "We have to go," Jenna whispered, her voice trembling as the figures closed in on them. But it was too late. The ground beneath them split wide open, revealing a chasm of darkness that seemed to stretch forever into the depths of the earth. The figures, shadows of the damned, reached for them with bony hands, their voices a chorus of whispers. Jenna screamed as the ground gave way, and they fell. The fall felt endless. Jenna's screams echoed in the darkness as they plunged deeper and deeper into the abyss. The air was cold, and the wind howled in her ears like 1,000 voices whispering secrets she couldn't understand. When they finally hit the ground, the impact knocked the breath from her lungs. Jenna gasped, struggling to sit up. Pain shot through her body, but she was alive. She turned to Greg, who lay motionless beside her. "Greg," she whispered, shaking him gently. He groaned, his eyes fluttering open. Where are we?" Jenna looked around, but there was no clear answer. They were no longer in the forest. They were in a vast, dark cavern, the walls lined with jagged rock that shimmered with an eerie red glow. The air was thick with heat, and the smell of sulfur burned Jenna's nostrils. It felt like they had fallen into the depths of the earth itself. "Is this hell?" Greg asked, his voice shaking as he sat up, clutching his leg in pain. Jenna didn't answer. She didn't know. But there was something deeply wrong about this place. It felt ancient, malevolent, as if it had been waiting for them all along. A narrow path stretched out in front of them, leading deeper into the cavern. Jenna's heart pounded in her chest as she stared into the darkness. "We have to keep moving," she whispered. "We can't stay here." Greg nodded weakly, and with her help, they limped forward, following the path. The walls seemed to close in on them as they walked, the heat growing more intense with each step. And then they saw it. Up ahead, at the end of the path, was a massive gate made of black iron, twisted and gnarled like the roots of a dead tree. It stood tall and foreboding, and beyond it, Jenna could hear the distant sound of screams. "This is it," Greg whispered, his voice trembling. "This is the end." Jenna's heart raced as they approached the gate, the heat unbearable now. Her skin felt like it was on fire, her breath coming in shallow gasps. They had reached the gates of hell, but as they stood before it, the gate began to creak open. On the other side, a figure waited, tall, cloaked in shadows, its face hidden beneath a hood. Jenna's blood ran cold. The figure spoke, its voice a deep, echoing whisper. "You have come to the end of the road." Jenna took a step back, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't know what this figure was, but she knew one thing. She couldn't go through that gate. "Please," she begged, tears streaming down her face. "We don't belong here." The figure was silent for a long moment, its dark eyes fixed on Jenna. Then it spoke again, its voice soft, almost pitying. "The road to hell is not a place, but a choice." Jenna stared at the figure, confusion clouding her mind. What did it mean? The figure stepped aside, and for the first time, Jenna saw what lay beyond the gate. Not fire, not torment, but a mirror that showed her own reflection, pale, broken and lost. And in that moment, she understood. Hell wasn't a place they had fallen into. It was the path they had chosen, the choices that had led them here. The figure turned to Greg, who was trembling beside her. "Will you continue down the road?" it whispered. "Or will you turn back?" Jenna looked at Greg, her heart pounding in her chest. "We can still choose," she whispered, her voice shaking. "We don't have to go through that gate." Greg stared at her, his face pale, his eyes filled with fear. But slowly, he nodded. Together, they turned away from the gate, back toward the path they had come from. And as they walked away, the darkness began to lift. The road to hell was not one they would walk any longer. The cavern faded, and the suffocating heat began to dissipate. Jenna opened her eyes to find herself back on the same stretch of highway where their nightmare had started. The car was still in the ditch, the trees still looming, but something was different. The oppressive weight that had been pressing down on her, the overwhelming sense of doom, it was gone. They had escaped. Greg limped beside her, still clutching his injured leg, but there was a lightness in his eyes now, a hope that hadn't been there before. "We made it," Jenna whispered, almost in disbelief. But as they stood on the side of the road, staring into the quiet night, Jenna couldn't help but glance over her shoulder. The shadows of the trees still seemed too dark, too deep. The road stretched endlessly ahead, and though they had escaped the worst of it, Jenna knew one thing for certain. Some roads, once taken, could never truly be left behind. The road to hell would always be there, waiting,